Now, for more on President Xi's state visit, let's bring in Professor Dali Yang from the University of Chicago's Political Science Department. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rachelle.
Now, as we look at this visit, what kind of signal does Xi's visit to Geneva send to the global community?
Well, if there was any doubt that China might want to overturn the existing international order, this is clearly the climax that China is for the status quo. It is for the multilateral institutions as epitomized, symbolized by the United Nations. And of course, from global health to the Olympics and so on, China is in the thick of it in providing help, providing leadership, and also helping with UN peacekeeping.
Now, let's also look particularly about the significance of Xi's visit to the WHO and the Olympic capital of Lausanne. What really stands out for you?
Well, number one, the WHO is currently actually led by someone from China, from Hong Kong, Margaret Chan. Secondly, China, in fact, was heavily involved in fighting Ebola. A Chinese woman, a scientist, actually won the Nobel Prize for the drug fighting malaria. So China actually has been making those kind of contributions. And I think actually it's something that Mr. Xi is very proud of when he makes such a visit. And he wants to be to continue China's involvement along those kind of dimensions.
Now, clearly, there's a huge spotlight on Davos and what's happening in Geneva. And some analysts are actually saying that China intentionally chose this moment to really boost its global presence as both the US and the EU are undergoing some of these really dramatic changes. What's your take on that?
Well, it's both yes and no. Yes, because the world needs such a voice, and Mr. Xi delivered for the multilateral crowd, in many ways, the Davos man. But at the same time, part of the reason the Chinese have been less of a presence at Davos is because usually the annual meeting is held at a very inconvenient time, usually around the time of the Chinese New Year when the Chinese families gather. So it's very hard for China's national leaders to go. In fact, in past years, the most that they could do was to send the premier, but very often they send less than that. So this is actually fortuitous this year because the Chinese New Year is falling somewhat later, and they could actually visit at this particular moment. But of course, China already holds, for example, their own version of Davos in Hainan, and also the summer Davos in Tianjin and Dali as well. So China wants to be involved, but it's been a little awkward each year when they plan ahead for the schedule. So in the future, I hope there would be greater coordination between the World Economic Forum and China on the scheduling.
So as we step back and we look at China's economic priorities, as well as some of the messages that we've been hearing this week from President Xi, what kind of image does China really want to build?
Well, it wants a more open economic order, especially on trade and investment. And of course, China is also emphasizing, even though China has been running the trade surpluses and so on, it's been giving more than $500 billion in terms of aid over the last decade or so. So China would want to continue to reach out to especially the poorest countries of the world, as it itself actually has grown richer and more developed. So that's the message. But the challenge and the question people have been asking is, what about beyond trade? Because globalization is not simply about trade and investment. It's also about ideas, a lot of other institutions, so on. And that's the unanswered question.
And let's expand on that. So what sort of issues are we talking about as we look outside of that trade relationship?
Well, there are a lot of other issues, including, for example, especially issues of, for example, the rule of law, the issue of really, so sort of to what extent China today is exporting outside, actually, but to what extent it would be more welcoming, because there have been some concerns that companies from the US, from the West, and Japan are leaving China and going elsewhere. Can China do more? President Xi did emphasize in his message to Davos, in fact, that China wants to welcome more investment by foreign companies and so on. But in terms of trying to attract that investment, that means more transparency, better rules in terms of attracting those investments. And also, companies want to move money out. But at the same time, however, we do know that China has tightened its foreign exchange management system in recent months. So some companies and individuals as well have found it more difficult to move their funds outside. So in that sense, actually, China has a lot to do. And I think actually, so sort of hopefully, measures would be taken to further open up China as well, not just actually making China open, making actually the rest of the world open to China.
Right, and to that end, President Xi actually said that he wanted China to, quote, pursue a win-win strategy of opening up, share our development opportunities with other countries, and welcome them aboard the fast train of China's development. So as we look ahead, how do you think this message is going to be received, especially in light of some of this rising protectionism we're seeing from some countries?
Well, at Davos, his message was extremely welcome, and there were several rounds of applauses for his message, and especially when he emphasized the importance of leadership and so on. So in that sense, he stepped up, he delivered in a way. And of course, with the May conference on One Belt, One Road in Beijing, I think actually China will come up with some additional measures, right, especially at that moment when a Chinese train is reaching all the way to London. But at the same time, however, that also puts the pressure on other countries in terms of trying to do more, in terms of making those kind of connections. I think, however, so sort of people are going to be asking China to do more as well in terms of being open in those other areas, including on the issue of rule of law. Right. But at the same time, I think actually, so sort of to what extent people are going to be asking, for example, the Trump administration. I think President Xi is sending a very strong olive branch also to Washington. We can talk on many of those issues, including on investment and so on.
Professor Dali, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Professor Dali Yang from the University of Chicago.